We're going to talk in this hour about lots of efforts to reform our criminal justice system, many of which were designed and developed and implemented after we watched George Floyd be killed by police in May of 2020. We thought we were in this moment in this country that we would see some really positive reforms that would address these types of racially profiling that we see by some police departments and reduce the violence that the Black community experiences at the hands of rogue police officers. Well, Republicans have something else in mind. They are taking advantage of some high-profile cases of violence that are amplified on social media, amplified in the media, to drive voters to believing that there is a spike in crime. And we know what we do in this country when we are under the belief that there's a spike in crime. We have this knee-jerk reaction that says, rather than police reform or criminal justice reform, we need to spend more money on police. We need to increase and enhance police budgets across the country. So this hour, we're going to talk about what can cities like Memphis do when they are righteously trying to engage in criminal justice reform, trying to reduce the disparities that we see in our criminal justice system, but yet they are being handcuffed by Republicans in state legislatures and Republicans who are stoking the flames that we are seeing an increase in crime in this country rather than a decrease. Professor Charis E of the University of California at Irvine is joining us, and Professor David Ikard, Professor of African American Studies at Vanderbilt University, will also be joining us in this hour. Let me start with you, Professor Kubrin. I'm reading this Washington Post article, recent article that says, killings by police brought reforms. Fear of crime is unraveling them. We know in this country when any party or any demographic, talks about an increase in crime, there's this knee-jerk reaction that happens, which is, let's not talk about the root of crime and why crime is happening, but let's just pour more money into police. Let's roll back reforms that may have been implemented. And it seems like we're at that point again in this country where the high-profile, like I said, murder of George Floyd brought about a lot of police reforms. But now there's this fear that crime is on the increase, so we need to roll back those reforms, even though Joe Biden said at the State of the Union that crime is on a decline. We are in some ways have an all-time a low point in terms of crime. So help us understand what's happening. Why is there this stoking of fears about increasing crime numbers when stats are telling us that crime is actually on the decline?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on today. Really important topic, and I'm glad to be a part of the conversation. So it's nothing new that there is a real disconnect in our society between what we know about crime, criminologists will tell you about crime, and what people think about crime. There's a real gap. And that gap is because most people get their information about crime from headlines or politicians or other sources, and it's very easy to manipulate those sources. And so that's nothing new. I think in the case of rolling back reforms, we're at a point where when people get concerned about crime, whether it's actually rising or not, the knee-jerk response, as you mentioned, is to get tough on crime. And I call that sort of an emphasis in our society on back-end solutions rather than what we need to be doing more of, which is an emphasis on front-end solutions, things like prevention, as you mentioned.
So how does anyone know, based on what you just said, that politicians or other groups can create the illusion that crime is on the increase or that there's more crime in a particular community? How does the everyday citizen, everyday resident know what the crime rates, the real crime rates are in their neighborhood or in their community?
Right. I think it's really important. I tell this to my students all the time. It's important to be a smart consumer of the news. It's important to be a smart consumer of what politicians and local officials are saying. Public crime data is available on websites. One could look that up and learn about it. One can make sure that when stories are being represented about crime, that there's criminologists and other experts on there that provide the context and the proper information and data that is necessary to know what's really happening. So I think it's important for folks to educate themselves on this issue, not simply read something in a headline and take it for granted, or hear something on the television news and assume that's the case. I also, sorry, on that one last thing on that, I commend fact checkers for doing a lot of the work for folks. In fact, I just got contacted today by a fact checker who wanted me to give some context to a statement made by former President Trump around crime rates just continuously going up in this country. And so I was able to provide reasons why that was not the case and data to show why that is not the case. So I think that's important work that needs to be done, and folks need to be real critical as they take in crime statistics.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to say one thing we hear from Donald Trump and other Republicans is about all the crime that's committed by folks crossing the borders, and this notion that folks crossing the border are, that these, the worst of the worst are coming into our country, right? Rapists and murderers and people who are committing horrible crimes. And we saw, the young Georgia student, I think she was a nursing student, who was killed by, perhaps it was a Venezuelan immigrant that came into the country. So how are we to interpret that? Because again, you could get a steady diet of, news and comments about immigrants that can cause people to think, oh my God, I should hate immigrants because they're bringing all this crime into our country.
Right. Well, in addition to studying criminal justice reform, my other big area of research is around the immigration crime link. And I've been studying this. So you hit the nail right on the head there. I've been studying this topic for 15 years, and just last year published a book called Immigration and Crime: Taking Stock, which actually reviews every single thing we know about how immigration and crime are related. And the interesting thing is the conclusion of this book is that immigration and crime do not go hand in hand as most people perceive. In fact, it's one of the biggest erroneous beliefs in society that exists today. And certainly if you read the headlines and listen to what some politicians are saying, you would think that the entire crime problem that exists in the United States is simply because of immigrants, and particularly undocumented immigrants. The data show just the opposite. I recently published, in fact, a week ago, an op-ed in the LA Times around the Lake and Riley case, claiming that the argument that immigrants are responsible for all of crime problems is diverting our attention away from what I truly believe is a bigger problem in our society, which is violence against women. And I think there's been a rush to focus on immigrants as scapegoats for all of society's problems. And that comes at the cost of identifying additional concerns in society around crime, particularly, again, victimization of women or violence against women.
So let me unpack what you said. You said, again, dropping some great knowledge here and helping us understand, disabusing, hopefully, our viewers that maybe have bought into these false narratives about the link between immigration and crime. So what has your studies, what has your research shown in terms of, are immigrants less likely to commit crimes, more likely to commit crimes, or commit crimes at the same rates, as those of us who are not immigrants? And again, I appreciate that you are distinguishing between the quote unquote undocumented immigrants, because this country is full of immigrants. So when we use that broad term, we also are just painting with too broad of a brush.
Oh, I totally agree. So what a colleague of mine, Graham Owsley, and I did what's called a meta-analysis of the literature several years ago. This is where we analyzed the findings of a huge body of research, over 20 years worth of research on the immigration crime link, to determine what the overarching finding of that body of research is. And what we found was that immigration to an area really has no impact on crime whatsoever. When it did impact crime, it was more likely to lower it than raise it. And then in addition to that,
wait a minute. What do you mean to lower it? That's interesting.
Yeah. So cities that saw the biggest increases in immigration were likely to see decreases in crime, controlling for other factors that tend to be correlated with both immigration and crime. So the overarching finding was that there's no relationship, but when a relationship was documented in studies, on average 2.5 times, it was more likely to be negative, meaning more immigration, less crime, than positive. Now, we also know from other studies, and we review this in our book, that immigrants on average engage in lower rates of offending than their native-born peers. And I haven't done work specifically in that area, but in our book, we review the studies that have looked at immigrant criminality. And again, we find that across these studies, immigrants are less likely to offend than their native-born counterparts.
Wow, really interesting work. Unfortunately, Dr. Ikard has joined us. Unfortunately, Dr. Ikard, we never hear those stats. We never hear that information that there is a negative correlation between immigration and crime, and definitely not that, you know, immigration is not in any way correlated with crime. We hear just the opposite. This outcry of, you know, immigrants being rapists and murderers. And people buy into that, and as I said, develop this anti-immigration, anti-immigrant bias. And same thing happens with respect to African Americans, particularly African American men. We have these horrific stereotypes that are perpetuated in the media, and then people believe that all Black men are dangerous. I was even talking to a healthcare professional a couple of weeks ago about a 15-year-old boy who was shot and killed by police, and he kept referring to him as a man. And I had to stop him. I said, why are you calling this 15-year-old kid a man? I said, that's a part of the stereotypes that are perpetuated that makes law enforcement in particular think of Black people, even Black kids, as dangerous. Obviously, Dr. Ikard, this isn't new. And I know as a historian and as a professor of African-American history, this is something that has been pervasive throughout history. But is it worse now, or is it about the same? These perpetuating of these negative stereotypes.
Again, I always appreciate being on your show, because you always come from an informed perspective, and you ask the hard questions, and you're committed to not just engaging the ideas, but you're also deeply committed to educating your viewers, which is a form of empowerment, and we need more of this. So again, you know, hats off to you for continuing doing this incredible work. But to answer your question, I mean, Toni Morrison says that when we come to addressing these issues, the issue is distraction, right? White supremacist institutional kind of capitalism always wants us to distract away from the facts of, you know, institutionalized historic white oppression, white terrorism, white privilege. And so it's interesting, you know, when we because we're talking about data, we're talking about studies, and it has been long known that immigrants are not more violent, they're not more criminal. In fact, the next generation of immigrants tend to actually uptick towards being more criminal, only to the extent to which they acclimate to the status quo of the current society. In other words, we're the bad influence, right, when it comes to, like, the immigrants, when it comes to crime. But it doesn't really so much matter. I think sometimes it can be very, very frustrating for people who actually believe in data and facts and history, to think that somehow having a certain kind of knowledge will educate people and correct these stereotypes, when in fact, time and time again, and particularly history shows that this is not about facts. This is not about the record. This is about what people have an investment in believing, what they need to believe in order to maintain their system, their sense of victimhood, their sense of being cheated. And there is a way in which we have real issues that white Americans are dealing with in terms of, you know, trying to pay for their grocery bills, trying to get jobs, and these kind of things, which are primarily being done by corporations that are run by people that look like them. White men, right, are doing this. But historically, from slavery to, right, you know, Native American genocide and on and on and on, the standard go-to, particularly for the upper crust of white America when it comes to these types of issues, is to blame people of color for the problems that the majority population is dealing with. And so even when we have all this incredible rich data, because this data about immigration is not new. When Donald Trump first said this some 8 years ago, whenever he started running for president, that they're bringing across these rapists and all this kind of stuff, plenty of sociologists came out and said these are just simply unfactual. And they said similar things that are being made today, similar data that's being made today, that no, like immigration has a lot of economic benefits. It has nothing to do with crime. A lot of these people are coming from situations where they're trying to make a better life for their children. They bring money into the economy, right? That they're economically beneficial. Their children are beneficial. People serve in the military, so on and on and on. But they become convenient scapegoats to explain away many homegrown issues that are not about immigration, and it's really about corporate greed and white privilege, and us not being able to deal with our increasingly diverse society.
I'm so glad you said that. Just made me think about, when you hear folks say that immigrants are taking all the resources from public schools. And if you know anything about public schools, butts in seats are very important. So,
right, yeah.
So as middle-class families and affluent families are leaving public schools in droves because they have money and they can go to private schools.
Yes.
It's causing a huge budget deficit and cash crunch for school districts because they have butts in seats. And if anything, the immigrant kids are helping some of those schools stay afloat because otherwise they have no students.
Right, to your point, I remember, and I forget how long ago it was, that I think it was either Alabama, Louisiana, they started going into these schools and arresting, like getting the children, arresting the parents at the schools because they were trying to crack down on immigration, right? And it was during like the spring, it was springtime. And so they had this major exodus of like immigrants leaving the state because they were afraid they were going to get arrested, whatever. Well, then a lot of these people were the ones who were the workers for picking the strawberries and the various types of things. And all of the local industry was like, what are you doing? You just ran off our fruit is literally rotting on the vine. And then the government's like, it's like you start believing what is James Baldwin says. He said, those who insist upon innocence long after that innocence has passed turns themselves into monsters.
Wow.
Right.
Hold that thought for me, Professor Ikard. When we come back, we want to talk about these historic low crime rates and get back to Professor Kubrin's point about the distraction as it relates to crime against women, because, of course, we want to make that a priority of this conversation. Professor Kubrin, in that Washington Post article that I referenced, there was a statement that said crime trends are at historic lows, yet people in general remain extremely concerned about crime. So tell us, where are crime rates in relationship to other periods in our, say, in the last 10, 15 years in this country?
Right. Of course, it varies city by city, and, you have to make caveats and that sort of thing. But it is the case that, in fact, if you take a longer term viewpoint on crime, we are generally doing fairly well compared to, the crime rise that we saw in the 80s through the early 90s. And in terms of violent crime, which is what most people are concerned about, murder, rape, robbery, assault, we've recently seen some pretty serious drops, particularly in homicide in cities all across the United States. Again, there's always exceptions. Cities like DC, for example, have seen some upticks in violent crime and homicide in particular. But overall, it is not as bad as one might think listening to the headlines. And of course, I always want to say that, of course, any crime is bad, particularly when it comes to violent crime. And we never want to minimize the harms that violent crime and other crimes do in communities, particularly communities that are struggling financially and have a lot of issues. However, it's important to provide the proper numbers and context in which to have these discussions.
So you also, thank you for that. You also said that some of this hype is distracting us as it relates to crime against women. Address that, please.
Yeah, it was really interesting a few weeks ago when the Lake and Riley killing happened. I was contacted by a number of outlets to give some context to what we know about immigration and crime. And I went on PBS NewsHour and did an interview where I was simply asked very straightforward questions about what do we know about immigration and crime. And I gave my answers. I talked about the studies. And then I proceeded to receive just a huge backlash of emails and phone calls that were what I can only describe as misogynistic hatred. Was really unlike anything I had ever seen before. I mean, I've been speaking around the issue of immigration. I've always gotten anti-immigrant sentiment. But what I noticed about this recent backlash is it was very misogynistic. In addition to people having an issue with what I was saying around immigration, they were also calling me very gendered terms and really just extremely misogynistic comments. And it reinforced a feeling that I have been having for a long time. The crime in society is around this misogyny and violence against women, which is also not being addressed in broader society. And so I was talking about that with a colleague, Sarah Shannon at the University of Georgia, who studies some of this. And we decided to write an op-ed, and we wrote this LA Times op-ed. And in the op-ed, we argued that it's important to not be distracted around this politicization of immigrant criminality, and instead focus on where the true crime problem lies. And in the case, I think a part of it has to do with violence against women. And we provide a lot of really alarming statistics around this topic that I think are very important for folks to be aware of. And I don't think most people are aware of.
It's women, is it in any particular city or state? And what types of crimes are we talking about?
Sure. Well, so we gave real national broad brush strokes because I think that's important. And just to give you some example, historically, men are likely to be the victims of serious violence in our society, but the gap has really closed in recent years. If we take female homicide victims, for example, a third of them are killed by strangers, but most are killed by intimate partners or other people they know. Just to give you a more concrete number, in 2020 alone, 47,000 women were killed by intimate partners or family members across the world. 41% of American women have experienced physical or sexual violence or stalking by an intimate partner. And 1 in 3 reports having experienced severe violence or stalking. So there's just so many statistics that we cite in the piece that one could find that raise real concerns around true crimes. Nobody's rushing off to introduce new legislation or policies around violence against women. We see that happening around immigration. So misplaced concern as far as I'm concerned.
And just, I want to better understand the hate mail, the vitriol that you received was because you, what was the basis of it? I'm not sure I understand the connection.
The basis of it was the fact that I had the gall to go on a show like PBS NewsHour or speak to the media around what the facts are around immigration and crime. Okay. And I think the fact that I am a woman was central to the critique. Every single hatred-filled email or phone call that I received was from a man. I could either hear it in their voice as they left me a message, or they signed off their name on the email.
And they were angry because you were stating the facts that there's no correlation between immigration and crime.
Right. And then for that, I'm a C, I'm a B, and just on and on and on. The name calling and the vitriol and the misogyny was dripping in all of these. And of course, when the LA Times op-ed came out, it happened all over again.
So Professor Ikard, what Professor Kubrin is saying is that not only are we not telling the American people the facts, the true facts and the data and stats about crime and immigration, is that she's also saying when people like her who have all this data and information try to set the record straight, that there are people in our society that, will come for you, will come after you because they don't want the facts. They don't want the truth. They want us living in this false narrative.
Absolutely. It reminds me of a colleague of mine, Brittany Cooper, who is always on the receiving end of this type of vitriol whenever she talks about structural inequalities or issues that disproportionately affect Black women. There will be people who will come out of the woodwork, including some Black men, and they will try and refute what she's saying, not on the basis of the data she provides or the information she provides, but the history, but because it doesn't line up with what they feel is the reality. And then they will confirm, in fact, the critique by referring to her as overweight and fat and all these kinds of things. And as Professor Kubrin has said, you know, here comes all of the epithets about, you know, that we associate in terms of misogyny about, you know, women. So the critiques of the body, calling people the B word, the C word, and all in between, of course, the N word, because she's a Black woman as well. And so literally confirming in the actual response to the critique that, in fact, we are a radically racist, xenophobic, and sexist society, right? And there doesn't seem to be, because we have normalized a certain kind of rage, and particularly white male rage, that when you point these things out, they seem to get like legitimized. That's why Brittany Cooper came up with the term eloquent rage to talk about Black women's rage, to give it some type of legitimacy. Because oftentimes when Black women talk about their experiences of oppression or violence, they're dismissed as being angry Black women who are just out to be perceived as victims, as opposed to people who have legitimate concerns and who have data to back those things up. So Cooper developed the term eloquent rage to legitimize those experiences. So these things don't surprise me. Toni Morrison calls them a distraction. She says you should anticipate that whenever you present information that is not in line with what people imagine themselves to be in the world they live in, that they're going to attack you, in some cases on the very basis of those racist, sexist discourses that you're actually critiquing.
Yeah, when we come forward, I want to talk about this again, these false narratives about property theft. We saw a lot being made of some of the snatch and grab kind of crimes that were happening, particularly during COVID. Again, that narrative being used to stoke fears and to suggest that, you know, urban crime was out of control and that certain mayors, particularly Black mayors, Black women, were not taking control of their cities. And also, why do we keep having the same reaction to crime when we know that getting at the root of crime would actually be the thing that would reduce it? Yet we somehow don't want to talk about the real reasons that crime exists in our communities. All right, Professor Kubrin, we heard a lot about these smash and grab robberies that were taking place at high-end stores and malls and places like, you know, Miracle Mile in Chicago, and even, you know, in places like Beverly Hills outside of Los Angeles. What's the status of those now? I just remember seeing stories that saying in San Francisco, you could just walk in and you know, take things out of stores up to $900 or so, and security wouldn't stop you. No one would stop you, as a way to suggest that, you know, San Francisco's mayor, London Breed, an African-American woman, had, you know, lost control of the city and was letting crime run amok in the city.
Boy, you know, when it comes to retail theft, there has been a lot of misinformation and damaging headlines that really has been problematic. I mean, the thing is retail theft comes in a variety of flavors, everything from shoplifting to commercial burglary, commercial robbery, and then the organized retail theft, the smash and grabs. And the reality is that if you look at the data, they're doing very different things. And the Public Policy Institute of California has been researching this. They've put out a lot of reports that provide the data for the state of California on what we know about trends in retail theft. And I think it's important to be knowledgeable about the variability in those trends. Smash and grabs are extremely problematic. They're something that need to be addressed, but they also receive outsized scrutiny in the headlines, and they grant the perception that this is happening just constantly. Things are out of control. While it's problematic and we want to stop it, we need to organize local task forces to figure out what's going on, so on and so forth. I think there are other things that we should be, you know, more concerned about. And we also need to put it in, again, put it in context. So I do think there's really been a lot of misinformation around the organized retail theft, even as that's something we need to be solving and fixing in society.
And so, Professor Ikard, one of the things in this Washington Post article that I've been making reference to throughout the hour is, again, this knee-jerk reaction that we have as a society when there is a legitimate, real increase in crime, not just these made-up headlines, that the response is always the same. Put more police on the street, give more money to police, increase their budgets. And there's no, you can speak to this. Is there any correlation between reducing crime and increasing police budgets or increasing the number of police on any police department? That's one of the things that we often hear as the way we should fight crime. Like, get tough on crime. You used that term earlier, Professor Kubrin. That usually means hire more police. That's getting tough on crime, or making prosecutors prosecute every infraction that someone may engage in, and then give them these super long jail and prison sentences.
See, the problem is, and again, research has been done that shows that police officers in general are more racist than the general population. So you take the average, say white person, and you give them a series of questions around racial bias, and there's kind of, they have a kind of a baseline of what that looks like. Most police officers, white police officers, are above that baseline. So most police officers are found to be more racist than the general population. When you then take that same survey and give it to Black police officers, because they want to say, oh, is it the police force in general, or is this broken down by race? They find that in fact Black police officers are less racist than the general population when it comes to like Black folks, right? So that in fact, what some of these studies have concluded is that it's not that the culture in police culture shifts thinking in terms of the officers themselves, right? They don't come and then become cops and then, they shift their thinking. Is that being a police officer attracts racist people, right? So when you see these biased officers time and again, you realize like they're going into the police force because it supports these types of behaviors and these types of biases. Okay, so when you see that, then what you recognize is that, well, if in fact you're putting more emphasis in terms of the budgets into policing, but the police officers that are being hired are the ones who actually are more racist than the general population. And as one Black former police chief told me, he was talking about arresting this person who had a gun, young black man who had a gun, and how he managed to take the guy in without incident, right? The guy didn't get killed or whatever. And he said he got lambasted not only by fellow police officers, but also the district attorney was like, why didn't you just blow this dude away? Right? They wow. Like, and he was a police chief. They was like, why is this person alive?
Why do we have to do the paperwork, right?
Like, this is the police chief who's saying, like, instead of being accommodated, instead of being celebrated for de-escalating the situation in which nobody was harmed, they were able to adjudicate this in a peaceful manner. They were like, dude, now we got to prosecute this guy. This dude is on the still alive, whatever. So in other words, he said the culture was to shoot first, and ask questions later. In other words, the culture is to apply violence as a first measure in these contexts. When you mix that with what we know to be a racial bias within the police forces, then when we're pouring money into these institutions without addressing these dynamics, and we keep talking about reform, and yet nothing is actually fundamentally done, we're actually encouraging, because Black folks want good policing. When you survey Black people and you ask them about policing, time and time again, they say, no, we want good policing. But we want unbiased policing. We want to be safe. We don't want to be afraid of the police, right? We want to feel safe, but it's not that we don't want police, but we want fair, just, and good policing.
Yeah, and the last question for you, Professor Kubrin, is there any evidence that putting more police on the streets, putting more money in their budgets reduces crime? Because what I often read is that police aren't necessarily preventing crime. They're coming after crime is committed, trying to solve it.
Well, I just want to echo what Professor Ikard said, which is that it's about quality, not quantity. And so the debate is always, we need more officers. We just need more, but more of the same is not going to help because of the cultural issues that are going on, the selection issues that Professor Ikard talked about, and other things. And so I think it's about the quality. What are the police doing? How are they acting? How are they interacting with the community? Not simply add police and stir. That is not a solution. You're absolutely right. Most police work is reactionary. People call 911 to report a crime, the police show up. They are often not preventing crime in the way that either they think they can or that society demands that they do. And so I always tell folks, if you're expecting the police to exist and stop crime, that's a burden that they cannot meet. And and that incentive to meet often creates the kinds of problems that we're talking about on the show today. So I think it's also the incentive structure, which is crime clearance and getting crime stats, as opposed to working with the community and being commended for restraint, for example.
And so just finally, what should we be doing? Because we don't see money being poured into after school programs. And I don't mean no money, but, at the same rate, those kinds of programs, social service programs that could really arrest crime, could, take some kid who might grow up to commit crime or may commit crime as a teen, to prevent that. Is that naive to think that we could get to that in this society?
I'll start, and then Professor Ikard can chime in, which is we in California, we've done this. Prop 47, which is a criminal justice reform intended to decarcerate our state prisons, had as part of its existence the idea that all of the money saved by not incarcerating low-level offenders in our state prisons at the tune of $100,000 a year, all of that money saved could then be directed, in fact, is required to be directed to prevention in society. And so if you look at Prop 47, you'll see that a key component of that is the prevention component. And I think that's really important. So if more of our policies and practices incorporated that, again, follow the money. Where's the money going? When it's going to prevention, that's going to make a bigger difference in the long run. I think that's the kind of stuff we can be doing.
We are out of time. I've got to have both of you back. Such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your insights. Really, really valuable information. Again, thanks to both of you for the work that you do in this area.